Angus Adams, Chapter 17, The Echo. Happy birthday! Angus handed his present to Hamish. Mrs. McLeod, Ryan, and his mum, Mrs. Evans, all watched around the McLeod kitchen table as a grinning Hamish tore at the Avengers wrapping paper. Cool, thanks! Hamish held up the gifts. There was a book about Steve Irwin that came with a DVD of never before seen footage, plus a Lego Clone Troopers versus Droidicas. I can help you with it, said Angus, if you want. He was hoping to make up for the starfighter he'd started with Bodhi. Last night, he and Hamish had reviewed the video footage and discussed at length Angus's lucky escape the day before. Although he was reluctant, Angus thought it was probably time to tell their parents. He'd had a huge fright yesterday, and what if Scarface and the gorilla spotted him at the park or the shops? He didn't like the idea of being afraid for the rest of his life. Just wait until after the Eka, Hamish had begged. Otherwise the helicopter will totally freak out and likely cancel the whole trip. So that settled it. Sunday they would tell. Now the two mothers were discussing the school thefts. And poor Patricia Nesbitt is so upset about the iPad she'd bought for her granddaughter, honestly. It's just dreadful, said Mrs. Evans. Who'd want a stupid Dora the Explorer iPad anyway, muttered Ryan. Oh, was it Dora? How cute. Well, that makes it even worse, said his mother. All right, that's enough unpleasantness. Come on, Weans, said Mrs. McLeod in her thick Scottish accent. It's time to go have some fun at the Eka. With that, she bustled everyone out the door and the three boys into the car. Bye, have fun and be good, Ryan, said Mrs. Evans, waving. Buckle up, boys, said Mrs. McLeod, starting the car. Now we will buy lunch at the Eka, but I've been cunning enough to pack some snacks. Angus, me darling, have a wee brownie baked fresh this morning, she said, passing back a Tupperware container. The Eka was a wonderland of sights and smells. Angus looked around wide-eyed, the way he always did here, trying to drink in everything at once. After entering through Gate 4, they passed by the cattle and horse pavilions with the unmistakable waft of animals' poo and sawdust, which mixed in a strangely pleasant way with the smell of hot chips, smoky wood-fired pizzas and waffle cones. A voice blared incoherently from the loudspeakers over the top of manic carnival music. Passing by the enormous show ring, they stopped to watch a few quick-fire rounds of the wood chopping. Man, those guys were amazing. They could chop wood while standing on tiny platforms meters in the air. Then, on that, they went toward the famous Showbag Pavilion, being careful to stay together as a group. Mind you stay close, boys, sang Mrs. McLeod approximately every 30 seconds. We don't want anyone getting lost. Of course, Mrs. McLeod had given the boys each a wristband to wear which had her name and mobile number on it, just in case. There were people everywhere, young, old, and in between, were all chattering and laughing non-stop and walking and running every which way. All around, kids clutched ice creams or balloons or both. Angus looked on as one little girl had a complete meltdown, screaming her head off because she had dropped her ice cream in the dirt and let her balloon go at the same time. It was a helium-filled Barbie balloon, and he'd watched it sail high into the air and drift away towards the Ferris wheel. The crowd was thick outside the Showbag Pavilion as people came and went with their treasures. Angus got a fright for a second when he saw a man who looked a lot like Scarface. It couldn't be, could it? At the Eka? The man quickly disappeared into the throng before he could be certain, and Angus shook his head. You're being stupid, he said to himself. Just still a bit shaky from yesterday and seeing things that aren't there. Luckily for them, the queue at the Showbag Pavilion didn't stretch too far. Angus had never seen so many showbags in his life, and he stared in wonder at the overwhelming choice displayed on the surrounding walls. Showbag heaven. But all three boys knew exactly what they wanted, and before long, Angus, Hamish, and Ryan each had the much sought-after Avengers bag dangling from their arms. Angus's mum had given him extra money to get Liam a Karate Ninja Deluxe bag, and he managed to do that also. Oh, go on, why don't you each have a wee Bertie Beetle show bag too? Said Mrs. McLeod as she handed over more money to the bored-looking teenager behind the counter. The Bertie Beetle chocolate bags were great value at only $2 each. But don't eat all the chocolate at once or you'll be sick. With show bags secured and a couple of Bertie Beetles scoffed, it was time for some serious ride action inside Show Alley. They had two goes on the dodgems, the second one ending early after Hamish hilariously caused a major pile-up. The cars getting so jammed together the ride had to be halted while a maintenance guy was called in to fix things. They lined up for rides with names like the Cha-Cha, the Sizzler, and the Boom Boom, each one involving having their bodies strapped in before being hurled about with tremendous force, backwards, forwards, sideways, and every other which ways. It was epic. But then there was the freakout, an extreme ride. The freakout looked like a giant kitchen stick blender. Ride goers were strapped onto the end of it and spun around upside down, perilously high in the air. Angus knew what his limits were and decided he was already plenty freaked out enough, thank you very much. Ryan agreed with him, and neither of them would budge as Hamish begged them to go on the ride with him. In the end, he probably would have gone on it alone, except his mother stepped in and said, "No way." It was a good thing Mrs. McLeod, who wasn't born yesterday, as she was fond of saying, had led them to the rides before lunch and not after. Lunch consisted of plump golden dagwood dogs dripping with tomato sauce, chocolate milkshakes, and for dessert, the Icker's famous strawberry sundaes. Not even Hamish felt much like spinning around upside down after all that. The plan for the afternoon was to get a good seat at the show ring and watch the sheepdog trials and try to wait patiently for the monster truck spectacular. It would be an awesome way to finish the day. On the way to the show ring, they all stopped to watch a guy on stilts perform his juggling act. Later, Angus would think about how that was the moment it all went wrong. He needed to go to the toilet. Looking around, he saw a toilet block right behind them and asked Mrs. McLeod if he could just duck in. She insisted Hamish go too. It was one of her Eka rules that nobody went anywhere alone, and took their show bags. As they went to enter the toilet block, who should they run into but Finn from school? Hamish stopped to chat with Finn for a minute and to check out his show bags, but Angus was busting. "Hi," he said, and he darted into the toilet. Washing his hands at the basin, he was thinking about monster trucks when his skin suddenly felt prickly. It was as if the air pressure had changed or something. Something was wrong. Uneasily, he looked up into the mirror. Standing over him, smirking hideously back in the mirror, was Scarface. "Well, well, if it isn't Camera Boy," he said with an amused sneer. "Okay, have to get up fast." Angus tried to dash past, half ducking as he went, but Scarface grabbed hold of his jacket collar. "What's the rush, mate? You and I have got some catching up to do. I want that camera, and you're going to give it to me." Where the heck was Hamish? "Come with me," said Scarface, and began to pull it. And Scarface and began to pull at him. Angus was about to start screaming as loudly as he could when a father with two little boys came barreling in. Distracted, Scarface loosened his grip enough that Angus wrenched free and made a lunge for the door. The toilet block had two entrances, and he was forced to head for the far one in order to get past Scarface. That meant he exited on the other side, away from where Mrs. McLeod and the others were waiting. With his heart once again in his throat, Angus tore off. A quick look over his shoulder told him Scarface was hot on his heels. Dodging people and prams, Angus had the advantage of being small and nimble and a good runner. Sidestepping an elderly lady, he dashed into the crowded fresh food pavilion. Past the apples and oranges, past the pineapple and banana display. He hoped the crowd would have helped him lose the terrifying Scarface, and it might have too, except he stood on some dropped grapes, skidded and nearly lost his balance before righting himself. With Scarface gaining on him, Angus fled out the nearest exit, raced around the dairy hall, up some steps, and found himself in Animal Boulevard. Halfway down the central aisle, past the goats, calves, and ducks, he risked a look back to see Scarface hurtle through the door and stop and scan the crowd. Searching for him, obviously, and made more difficult by a large school group, bless them, in the middle of the pavilion. Thinking quickly, Angus knelt down and squeezed between the railings of the closest pen. He crouched in the corner using the railings for cover. Half a dozen very surprised piglets looked at him in astonishment, but unless Scarface actually peered over the railings, he wouldn't see him. The seconds ticked by. He risked a peek through the railings. Scarface had come up the aisle and was just meters away, eyes darting furiously. Angus made himself as small as he could. A mobile phone rang. Scarface was right beside him on the other side of the railing. He could see the man's shiny, polished black shoes between the gap of the lower railings. Scarface muttered a swear word, and then the phone stopped ringing. "What? No, I'm at the Icker. You won't believe it, but I'm in the animal thing, chasing that kid. Yeah, the kid who had the camera, yeah." Then more impatiently, "No, the bantam hens won't get judged until 3 o'clock. For my mother, you idiot. Yeah, win every year." Angus couldn't hear what else was said as Scarface walked away. So he was here to show his mother's prize-winning bantam hens. If things weren't so serious, Angus might have laughed out loud. As it was, he saw something on the ground right where Scarface had been standing. It looked like a small card of some kind. He sneaked his hand out and picked it up. Scarface must have dropped it when he took out his phone. Angus was certain it hadn't been there before. Dropping the card straight into his jacket pocket without looking at it, his intention now was to sit tight until Scarface left the pavilion. Peeking over the top railing, Angus watched his back retreat down the aisle until he was almost at the door. And it all would have been fine, except right at the moment one of the animal attendants spotted him in the pig stall and called out, "Hey you, you're not allowed in there!" Scarface turned and saw Angus, who jumped over the railing and tore off again toward the far exit, dodging toddlers and grannies. Once again, Scarface was hot in pursuit. Angus jumped the exit steps and was now outside. He sprinted up the side of the animal pavilion, past Expo Place, and glanced back to see Scarface still after him. He turned and, panicking a little, headed straight through the nearest door, which was another toilet block. So he should have been able to run straight out the exit and on the other side. Oh no, this toilet block didn't have another exit. He was trapped. Certain Scarface had seen him go in, Angus did the only thing he could do, which was to run into the only empty toilet stall available and lock the door. In complete panic now, he looked under the door to see Scarface's shiny black shoes enter the toilet block. How was he going to get out of this? He couldn't sit in the toilet stall all day. Looking around, Angus realised he was in the end stall, meaning it butted up against the outer cement wall. High up on the wall was a small window, an open window. Without thinking, Without waiting to think too much about it, he climbed up on the top of the toilet cistern, reached across, grabbed the window ledge with both hands, and swung himself up. "Hey!" yelled Scarface, who could see him now above the toilet door. But Angus didn't wait around. In a second, he had himself through the window and leapt down to the ground, being careful to land on bended knees. Knowing Scarface would certainly be running around the toilet block to catch him, he turned and took off. He rounded a corner and crash! He smacked straight into a man, a large bald man with a badge and a walkie-talkie, a security officer. "Whoa there, Sonny. Where's the fire?" said the security guy with his hands on Angus's shoulders. He looked around to see Scarface standing back about 10 metres, panting heavily. I'm lost," said Angus, turning back to the security guard and trying his best to sound upset, which wasn't hard because he was, in fact, very upset. "I can't find my friends. Can you please help me?" At this, Scarface slipped silently away into the crowd. The security officer took Angus back to Mrs. McLeod and the others, still standing by the toilets. Finn was still there with his mum and dad. McLeod was busy talking to another security officer when they walked up. "What will I tell his mother? This is the most dreadful thing." And then she saw Angus. "Oh, Angus, there you are. Thank goodness. Where have you been? We thought you were lost. I was about to have a heart attack." She grabbed him and hugged him close until he couldn't breathe. When he was finally able to prise himself free enough to talk, he'd explained how he'd gotten confused, gone out the wrong exit of the toilet, and yes, had become a bit lost. "Sorry about that." "Crikey," said Hamish. "Were you scared?" asked Ryan. "Epic fail," laughed Finn. For the rest of the day, he stuck close to Mrs. McLeod, who wasn't going to let him out of her sight anyway. Although he kept a lookout, he didn't see Scarface again. He watched the monster truck show mostly in silence, eating the muffins and brownies handed to him by Mrs. McLeod. The show was good. Lots of enormous trucks with monster faces rampaging around and crushing small cars into oblivion. Even so, Angus felt he could have done without extra excitement.